58 years old, after 33 years of marriage, Margaret Holloway walked out of a courthouse carrying a cardboard box, the keys to a rusted pickup truck, and the deed to an abandoned gas station hidden deep in the Allegheny Highlands. It was the only thing her ex-husband's lawyers hadn't wanted. Gregory Vance kept the house. He kept the savings account, the retirement funds, and the comfortable life they had spent decades building. He even kept the friends who had smiled at Margaret across dinner tables for years. Margaret was left with $211 in her checking account and a property nobody thought was worth fighting over. 4 hours later, she was winding through mountain roads she hadn't traveled in more than a decade. The station her father had left behind sat on a forgotten stretch of State Route 42, surrounded by forest and silence. Walter Holloway had been dead for 12 years. His station had been closed ever since. Margaret had come for one reason only: to sell it. The place smelled of dust and memories. Her father's reading glasses still rested beside an unfinished crossword puzzle on the counter. The old mechanical cash register sat exactly where he had left it. Nothing seemed to have changed. Then she discovered a hidden compartment behind the register. Inside was a leather journal, a lockbox, and a bundle of letters tied together with faded twine. That night, sitting alone in the darkness of the abandoned station, Margaret opened the first page. What she found there would force her to question everything she thought she knew about her father, and everything she believed about wealth, because Walter Holloway had spent 40 years building something no one could see, something more valuable than money, something an entire valley remembered. And before Margaret's journey was over, that forgotten gas station would give her back a future she never expected to find. The courtroom smelled faintly of floor polish and stale air. Margaret Holloway sat quietly while attorneys shuffled paperwork around her, as if 33 years of marriage could be reduced to signatures and file folders. Across the room sat Gregory Vance. He looked exactly as he always had. Confident, polished, and completely certain that life would continue bending in his direction. The judge reviewed the final settlement. House, Gregory. Retirement accounts, Gregory. Investments, Gregory. Vacation property, Gregory. The words blurred together after a while. Margaret listened without arguing. She had spent most of her marriage listening. When the hearing ended, Gregory stood first. He buttoned his expensive jacket, spoke briefly with his attorney, and walked out without looking back. Not once. Margaret remained seated for a moment. Then she gathered the cardboard box waiting beneath her chair. Inside were the few belongings Gregory had left for her: a photo album, a chipped coffee mug, several framed pictures. Nothing else. 33 years compressed into a single box. Outside, the afternoon sun felt strangely cold. The pickup truck waiting in the parking lot was nearly 20 years old. The paint was faded and the passenger door stuck whenever it rained. Gregory had once bought it for a landscaping contractor. Now it belonged to Margaret. She sat behind the wheel and stared at the deed resting on the passenger seat. Holloway Fuel and Auto Repair, Ashford County. The property had belonged to her father. When Walter Holloway died 12 years earlier, he left it entirely to her. Gregory had never cared about the station. His attorneys had valued it at barely $14,000 and treated it like a forgotten shed. For the first time in years, Margaret was grateful for their arrogance. She turned the ignition key. The truck coughed twice before starting. 4 hours later, the city disappeared behind her. Buildings gave way to farmland. Farmland gave way to mountains. The roads narrowed as she climbed deeper into the Allegheny Highlands. Autumn had begun touching the trees. Gold and copper leaves flashed among the green forests that covered the ridges. Margaret rolled down the window. Cool mountain air rushed inside. It smelled like earth, wood smoke, and rain. For the first time all day, she could breathe. As evening approached, she rounded a curve and saw the station. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. The building looked smaller than she remembered. 2 rusted gas pumps stood beneath a faded canopy. Vines crawled across one wall. The sign above the entrance was barely readable, yet the structure still stood. Waiting, Margaret parked and stepped out. The silence surprised her. No traffic, no voices, only wind moving through the trees. She unlocked the front door with one of the keys included in the deed packet. The hinges groaned. Dust filled the fading sunlight. Behind the counter sat the old cash register. Beside it rested Walter's reading glasses, and next to them lay the unfinished crossword puzzle. Margaret stared at the familiar objects. For a moment, she could almost hear her father's voice. Almost. She spent the next hour exploring. The apartment upstairs remained mostly intact. The repair garage still contained rows of carefully organized tools. Everything felt frozen in time. As darkness settled over the mountains, Margaret returned downstairs carrying a flashlight. She stood behind the counter and brushed years of dust from the wood. That was when her fingers found something unusual. A seam, hidden beneath the register, perfectly concealed. Her pulse quickened. Kneeling down, she slipped her fingers into the edge and carefully pulled. The wooden panel moved. Behind it sat a leather journal, a metal lockbox, and several envelopes tied together with twine. Margaret lifted the journal into her hands. On the first page, written in Walter Holloway's careful handwriting, were words that instantly changed everything. Lent Samuel Bishop $200 today. He'll never be able to repay it. That's all right. Margaret slowly turned the page and began to read. Margaret did not sleep much that night. She sat behind the counter with a flashlight beside her and Walter's journal open in her lap. Outside, darkness covered the mountains. Inside, page after page revealed a father she had never fully known. The entries stretched back decades. Each one was dated. Each one recorded a quiet act of kindness. Lent Patricia Nolan $80 for groceries. Said she'd repay me next month. Told her not to worry about it. Repaired Harold Green's roof before winter. Didn't tell him. Easier that way. Left school supplies in Emma Bishop's locker. Teacher agreed not to mention where they came from. Margaret kept turning pages. The amounts were rarely large. $20, $50, a tank of gas, a repaired transmission, a load of firewood. But the entries never stopped. Year after year, Walter had quietly carried the burdens of people around him. He had done it without recognition, without praise, without expecting anything in return. By midnight, Margaret's eyes were burning. She set the journal aside and untied the bundle of letters. The first envelope contained a handwritten note from a woman named Teresa Calloway. Walter, you saved our farm. You never said so, but I know it was you. The bank had already refused us. Then somehow the money appeared. My husband and I never forgot. The second letter came from a man named Franklin Reed. Mr. Holloway, that $50 you loaned me was the difference between eating and not eating that month. I hope someday I can help someone the way you helped me. There were dozens more. Each letter told the same story. Walter had stepped into someone's life during a difficult moment and quietly made it easier. Margaret found herself staring at the stack. Her father had never spoken about any of this. Not once. Growing up, she had assumed he was simply a hard-working mechanic running a small gas station. Now she realized he had been something else entirely. He had been the person everyone called when life went wrong. Near dawn, she opened another section of the journal. The handwriting grew shakier. Walter had been older when he wrote these entries. Then she saw her own name. Margaret froze. The entry was dated 3 years before his death. Margaret called today. Sounded tired. Says Gregory bought another luxury vehicle. Says everything is fine. Everything is not fine. A father knows the difference. I wish she'd come home for a while. I wish she'd sit in the garage and complain about life while I pretend not to listen. I miss my girl. Margaret's throat tightened. She kept reading. I think she's lonely. I think she's forgotten who she is. I hope one day she remembers. The words blurred. For several moments, she could only stare at the page. Walter had known. All those years, he had known. The exhaustion, the unhappiness, the quiet compromises she had made inside her marriage. He had seen everything and still left the door open. Morning sunlight was creeping through the dusty windows when Margaret finally closed the journal. The station felt different now. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Waiting. As if Walter had known someone would eventually return. A knock on the front door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret looked up. An older man stood outside wearing a weather jacket and a feed store cap. His truck was parked near the pumps. She unlocked the door. The man stared at her for several seconds. Then his face broke into astonishment. I'll be damned, he said softly. You're Walter Holloway's daughter. Margaret nodded. The man's eyes warmed immediately. Name's Benjamin Tate, he said. Your father was my best friend for nearly 40 years. Margaret stepped aside. Benjamin entered slowly, looking around the station. For a moment, he seemed overcome by memories. Then he looked back at her. "You've been reading his journals, haven't you?" Margaret felt a chill. "How did you know?" Benjamin smiled sadly. "Because sooner or later, everybody who loved Walter finds out the same thing." He glanced toward the old counter. "Your father spent his entire life helping people." Then he paused. "And you still don't know half of it." Benjamin Tate stayed for nearly 3 hours. He sat on an old stool beside the counter while Margaret brewed coffee using a dented pot she had found upstairs. The coffee tasted terrible, but neither of them seemed to care. For most of the morning, Benjamin told stories. Stories Walter had never shared. Stories Margaret had never heard. "He fixed my truck for free 3 different times," Benjamin said. "Every time I tried to pay him, he'd find some excuse not to take the money." Margaret smiled. "That sounds like him." Benjamin nodded. "That's the thing. Nobody knew how much he was doing because he never talked about it." He looked around the station. "Folks around here still do." As the afternoon passed, Margaret found herself listening more than speaking. For years, conversations with Gregory had revolved around investments, property values, business opportunities, and financial forecasts. Walter's world had been different. His currency had been people. By the time Benjamin left, he promised to return the next day. "You need anything? You call me." Margaret thanked him and watched his truck disappear down State Route 42. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The station had been abandoned for 12 years. Dust coated every shelf. The windows were cloudy. Dead leaves had collected against the foundation. She spent the afternoon cleaning. The physical work felt strangely satisfying. Each sweep of the broom revealed more of the floor. Each wiped surface uncovered another memory. As she worked, she noticed vehicles occasionally slowing down outside. Drivers stared at the station. Some even stopped briefly before continuing on. Word was spreading. Walter's daughter had come home. The next morning proved it. A casserole appeared on the front porch. No note, no explanation. Only a warm dish wrapped in a towel. An hour later, someone left a stack of firewood beside the building. That afternoon, a teenage boy delivered a box of cleaning supplies. The following morning, fresh bread appeared on the doorstep. Margaret never discovered who left most of it. The valley simply seemed to know she was there, and the valley remembered Walter. 3 days later, Margaret finally explored the repair garage in detail. The moment she stepped inside, she felt as if her father had just walked out for lunch. Every tool hung precisely where it belonged. Wrenches, sockets, pliers, screwdrivers. Walter's outline still marked each spot on the pegboard. In the corner stood a large green filing cabinet. Locked. Margaret remembered the small keys inside the lockbox. The second key opened the cabinet. Inside were dozens of folders. Every drawer was packed. Every folder contained names, families, records, updates. Walter had tracked the lives of people he helped, not to collect debts, to follow their progress. Margaret sat on an overturned bucket and read for hours. Then she heard an engine struggling outside. The sound was rough and uneven. Mechanical trouble. She stepped outside. A white pickup truck was limping toward the station. Steam escaped from beneath the hood. The vehicle rolled into the parking area and stopped. A young man climbed out. Tall, lean, covered in grease and road dust. He looked barely 30. The first thing he did was raise the hood and inspect the engine. The second thing he did was sigh. Margaret walked over. "Radiator hose?" she asked. The young man looked up sharply, surprised. "Yeah," he said. "Looks like it." Margaret folded her arms. "Got a replacement?" "In the truck." "Got tools?" The young man shook his head. "No." Margaret glanced toward the garage. "I do." For several seconds, he simply stared at her. Then he looked at the station, then back at her. "You serious?" "Very." An hour later, they were standing inside Walter's repair bay. The young man had removed the damaged hose in less than 10 minutes. His movements were quick, confident, professional. Margaret watched quietly. "What's your name?" she finally asked. The young mechanic tightened a clamp and wiped his hands. "Lucas Mercer." Margaret nodded. The station suddenly felt a little less empty. What she didn't realize yet was that Lucas Mercer was about to become one of the most important people in the next chapter of her life. Lucas Mercer finished replacing the radiator hose and lowered the hood. The engine started smoothly on the first try. He listened carefully for several seconds before nodding with satisfaction. That should do it. Margaret leaned against the workbench. You work on cars for a living? Lucas shrugged. Mostly. Mostly? His expression suggested there was more to the story. I've worked in a few garages. A few? They didn't last. Margaret noticed the answer wasn't really an answer. She didn't press. Walter had taught her years ago that people shared their stories when they were ready, not before. Lucas packed his tools into a weathered toolbox. As he lifted it into the truck bed, Margaret spoke. I'm thinking about reopening the station. He paused. The mountains were quiet around them. For the first time, saying the words aloud made them feel real. Lucas looked at the building, then at the garage, then back at Margaret. You're serious? I think I am. You'll need a mechanic. Margaret smiled faintly. So I've been told. Lucas studied her for a moment, then nodded. Well, if you decide to do it, you've got a decent garage. Before leaving, he climbed into the truck and rolled down the window. I'll stop by in a few days. Then he drove away. That evening, Margaret returned to the counter. The bundle of letters remained beside Walter's journal. She untied the twine again. Most of the remaining letters were familiar. Thank you notes, Christmas cards, photographs, lives Walter had quietly touched. Then she found something different, a sealed envelope. The paper was yellowed with age. Across the front, written in Walter's unmistakable handwriting, was a single word. Margaret. Her hands trembled slightly. She sat down, carefully opened the envelope, and unfolded the pages inside. The letter began simply, Dear Margaret, if you're reading this, then you finally came home. She stopped breathing for a moment. The station felt completely silent, as if the entire building were listening. Walter's words carried her back through time. I wrote this on a quiet October afternoon. Business is slow, and old men think too much when business is slow. I know you'll probably try to sell this place. Most people would. On paper, this station isn't worth much. The pumps are old. The building needs work. The road gets less traffic every year. But people make the mistake of measuring value the wrong way. Walter continued. The station matters because it exists. Because the lights are on. Because the coffee is hot. Because people know someone is here when they need help. That's what you're really inheriting. Not the building. Not the land. The responsibility. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She kept reading. I know more about your life than you think. I know Gregory measures success in dollars. I know you've spent years making yourself smaller to fit inside someone else's expectations. But you were never meant to live that way. You belong here more than you realize. Don't sell the station. Keep the coffee on. That matters more than you think. Love, Dan. For a long time, Margaret sat alone with the letter. The sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. Darkness filled the room. Yet somehow, she felt lighter. The loneliness that had followed her from the courthouse felt smaller now, as if Walter were still guiding her. The next morning, she pinned the letter inside the drawer beneath the register. Then she got to work. Benjamin arrived carrying lumber. Without asking permission, he began replacing the rotten porch railing. A woman dropped off paint. Someone else delivered hardware. By afternoon, 3 neighbors she had never met were helping clear vines from the side wall. No one discussed payment. No one asked for anything. They simply showed up, the way Walter had shown up for them. Day by day, the station began changing. The windows became clear. The porch looked new again. The garage doors opened for the first time in years. And then, just before sunset on the 6th day, a sedan pulled into the lot. An elderly woman stepped out and stared at the building. She looked at the fresh paint, the repaired railing, the open door. Then her eyes filled with tears. Is it true? She asked softly. Margaret stepped onto the porch. What is? The woman smiled. That Walter Holloway station is open again. Margaret looked at the glowing evening sky above the mountains, then at the station behind her. For the first time, the answer felt completely natural. Not yet, she said, but we're getting close. The woman nodded. Then she pointed toward the road. A second vehicle was already pulling into the lot, and behind it came a third. Word was spreading faster than Margaret ever imagined. The valley was coming back, and so was the station. The following Monday morning, Margaret unlocked the front door before sunrise. A chill lingered in the mountain air. Mist drifted through the trees surrounding State Route 42. For a moment, she stood on the porch, looking at the faded sign above the station. Holloway Fuel and Auto Repair. The letters were worn. The paint was chipped, but the building no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. Margaret unlocked the door and stepped inside. The coffee maker Benjamin had brought over the weekend sat on a small table near the entrance. She filled it with water and grounds. Within minutes, the familiar smell spread through the station. The first pot of coffee Walter would have approved. At 7 o'clock sharp, a pickup truck rolled into the lot. Margaret recognized it immediately. Lucas Mercer. He climbed out carrying a toolbox. You said you were reopening. Margaret smiled. And you said you'd stop by. Lucas looked around the garage. I'll give you a week. A week. We'll see how it goes. Margaret extended her hand. Lucas shook it. And just like that, Holloway Fuel and Auto Repair officially reopened. The first customer arrived less than an hour later, an elderly woman driving a white sedan, the same woman who had visited during the restoration. She stepped out slowly and looked around. Tears immediately filled her eyes. I never thought I'd see this place open again. Margaret smiled. Neither did I. The woman bought $20 of fuel, then stayed nearly an hour drinking coffee and sharing stories about Walter. By noon, 3 more customers had stopped. Not because they needed gas, because they wanted to see the station. News had traveled throughout Ashford County. Walter Holloway's daughter had reopened the old place. People came to remember. They came to talk. And they came because they missed Walter. One man drove 40 minutes just to sit on the porch and drink coffee. Another customer brought photographs of Walter helping repair a church roof years earlier. A retired teacher shared stories about Walter secretly paying for students' lunch accounts. Every visitor added another piece to the picture Margaret was building. The picture of the father she thought she knew. Meanwhile, Lucas transformed the garage. Within days, vehicles were arriving for repairs. Word spread quickly about the young mechanic working at Walter's station. Lucas was honest, efficient. And unlike many repair shops, he never charged for work that wasn't necessary. One afternoon, a farmer arrived with a transmission problem. After examining the truck, Lucas shook his head. It's not the transmission. The farmer blinked. The other garage said it was. It's a sensor. The repair cost less than $100. The farmer left, shaking his head in disbelief. By the next week, his brother brought in a truck. Then a neighbor. Then another. The garage stayed busy. Margaret found herself enjoying every moment. She worked behind the counter, served coffee, checked tire pressure, cleaned windshields, listened to stories. For years, she had spent her life attending charity galas, corporate dinners, and social events she never enjoyed. Here, conversations felt real. One afternoon, a young mother pulled into the station with 2 children in the back seat. Her fuel gauge was nearly empty. Margaret noticed the worry in her eyes immediately. The woman handed over a credit card. The machine declined it. Embarrassment flooded her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. Margaret looked at the children, then at the fuel pump. Without hesitation, she filled the tank. The woman protested. Margaret simply smiled. You can pay next time. The woman stared. Why would you do that? For a moment, Margaret thought about Walter's journal, the letters, the lives he had touched. Then she answered, because someone once taught me what's important. That evening, the woman left with tears in her eyes, and Margaret finally understood something. Walter had never helped people because he was generous. He helped people because he believed communities survived by taking care of one another. The realization stayed with her long after sunset. Business was growing. The station was finding its rhythm. Life felt hopeful again. Then, 3 weeks after reopening, a white envelope arrived in the mail. The return address stopped her cold. Sterling and Associates, Gregory Vance's attorneys. Suddenly, the peace Margaret had built began to crack, and she knew trouble was coming. Margaret stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. The morning rush had ended. Lucas was busy in the garage replacing brake pads on a pickup truck. Outside, several regular customers sat on the porch drinking coffee and talking about weather forecasts and cattle prices. Everything felt normal, peaceful. The letter in her hand changed that. Slowly, she unfolded the pages. The legal language was dense and formal, but the message was clear. Gregory Vance was seeking to reopen the divorce settlement. According to the filing, newly discovered information suggested that Holloway Fuel and Auto Repair had been significantly undervalued during the divorce proceedings. The attorneys claimed a proposed state highway expansion could dramatically increase the property's future value. Because of that possibility, Gregory now demanded a share of the station, or a court-ordered sale. Margaret read the letter twice, then a third time. Each reading left her feeling colder. The station suddenly seemed fragile. Everything she had rebuilt, everything Walter had left her, everything the community had helped restore, Gregory wanted all of it again. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into a drawer beneath the register. For several minutes, she simply stood there. The old fear was returning, the fear she had lived with throughout much of her marriage, the fear that Gregory always won, that somehow the rules bent in his favor. Lucas found her that afternoon. She was sitting alone behind the counter. The coffee had gone cold. "You okay?" he asked. Margaret hesitated, then handed him the letter. Lucas read silently. His expression darkened. He wants the station? He wants part of it. Lucas handed the papers back. "This place belonged to your father." "I know." "So why does he think you can take it?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "Because Gregory believes everything has a price." Lucas looked toward the front windows. Outside, customers continued talking on the porch. The station carried on, unaware of the threat hanging over it. Then don't let him. Margaret wished it were that simple. 3 days later, another complication arrived. Her daughter. Natalie Vance pulled into the lot driving a silver sedan. Margaret immediately recognized the look on her face. Concern, worry, and something else. Doubt. Natalie stepped inside. The station felt quiet. Several customers politely found reasons to leave. Mother and daughter stood alone. "Dad told me about the lawsuit." Margaret sighed. "Of course he did." Natalie crossed her arms. "He says the property might be worth a fortune." "It isn't. He says a highway project is coming." Margaret shook her head. "They've been talking about highways in these mountains for decades." Natalie looked around the station. The clean floors, the busy garage, the people laughing outside. Then she looked back at her mother. Why not sell it? The question landed harder than Margaret expected. "Because it's not for sale." "Mom, be realistic." "I am." "No, you're being emotional." The words stung, not because Natalie meant to hurt her, because Margaret had once said the same thing to herself. For years, whenever she ignored her instincts, whenever she surrendered to Gregory's decisions, whenever she chose comfort over conviction, Natalie sat at the counter. "I just don't want you getting hurt again." Margaret softened. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Finally, she reached across the counter and took her daughter's hand. "I know." Natalie's eyes glistened. "But this place matters. More than your future. This is my future." The answer surprised them both. For the first time, Margaret truly believed it. Natalie left before sunset, the conversation unresolved. The distance between them still there, but smaller. That evening, as the last customers departed, a familiar luxury SUV rolled into the parking lot. Margaret recognized it immediately. Gregory. He climbed out, wearing pressed slacks and an expensive jacket that looked absurd against the backdrop of the mountains. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Gregory smiled. The same confident smile she had known for 33 years. "Nice little project you've got here." Margaret folded her arms. "You didn't drive 4 hours to compliment the paint." Gregory glanced around the property. The garage. The pumps. The growing crowd of customers. The station was succeeding. She could see that realization in his eyes. And suddenly, she understood. This was never about the highway. Never about property values. Gregory had seen something thriving without him. Something he once dismissed. Something she had built on her own. And he couldn't stand it. "I came to save us both some trouble," he said. Margaret met his gaze. For years, she would have backed down. For years, she would have agreed. "Not anymore. I'll see you in court, Gregory." The smile vanished from his face. For the first time, he looked uncertain. And for the first time in a very long time, Margaret wasn't afraid. The morning after Gregory's visit, Margaret woke before dawn. Sleep had been impossible. She lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling of the apartment above the station, listening to the wind move through the trees. The lawsuit wasn't just a legal problem. It felt personal, as though Gregory was trying to erase everything she had become since leaving him, everything Walter had helped her rediscover. Downstairs, she started the coffee before sunrise. The familiar smell filled the station. For a while, she stood beside the old register, staring at Walter's journal. The station was quiet. Then, Benjamin Tate walked through the front door. One look at Margaret's face told him everything. "You didn't sleep." "No." Benjamin poured himself a cup of coffee. "Thinking about Gregory?" Margaret nodded. "I don't know how I'm supposed to fight this." Benjamin remained silent for several moments. Then he set down his mug. "I might know somebody." Margaret looked up. "Somebody?" "A retired attorney." That got her attention. Benjamin leaned against the counter. "Her name's Evelyn Bradford." Margaret recognized the name immediately. The woman had once been one of the most respected attorneys in the region. "Why would she help me?" Benjamin smiled. "Because of Walter." 2 days later, Evelyn Bradford arrived. She drove an aging gray sedan that looked practical rather than impressive. The woman herself appeared sharp, confident, and completely unimpressed by everything around her. She introduced herself with a firm handshake, then sat down at the counter. "Tell me everything." Margaret did. The divorce, the station, the lawsuit, Gregory's claims. Evelyn listened without interruption. When she finished reading the legal documents, she removed her glasses and smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a lawyer who had just discovered weakness in an opponent's argument. "This is nonsense." Margaret blinked. "What?" "The lawsuit." Evelyn tapped the papers. "Your father left this property directly to you." "Yes." "It was never jointly owned?" "No." "Your husband never contributed money toward improving it?" "No." Evelyn nodded. "Then Gregory doesn't have much of a case." Relief washed through Margaret. For the first time in weeks, she felt hope. "But why are you helping me?" she asked. Evelyn looked toward the mountains outside the window. For a moment, her expression softened. "When my daughter was 8 years old, she needed surgery." Margaret listened carefully. "My husband had already passed away. Insurance wouldn't cover everything." Evelyn smiled sadly. "I was losing that fight." "What happened?" "Someone paid the remaining balance." Margaret already knew the answer. "Walter." Evelyn nodded. "He never told me." Her voice grew quieter. "I only discovered the truth years later." Silence settled between them. Finally, Evelyn stood. "This case was paid for a long time ago." She extended her hand. "I'll represent you." Margaret shook it, and for the first time since Gregory's letter arrived, she believed she might win. That afternoon, while Evelyn reviewed documents in the office, Lucas worked in the garage. He had been organizing Walter's filing cabinet. Hundreds of folders filled the drawers. Most contained notes about families Walter had helped. Lucas was sorting records when one folder caught his attention. Mercer. His own last name. Curious, he pulled it free. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The moment he read it, everything around him seemed to stop. Dorothy Mercer. Heart valve surgery. Anonymous donation. $3,200. Do not tell family where funds came from. Lucas stared at the page. His hands trembled. Margaret found him nearly an hour later. He was sitting alone on a stool in the corner of the garage. The file remained open in his lap. "You okay?" Lucas looked up slowly. His eyes were red. "My grandmother." Margaret sat beside him. "The surgery?" He nodded. "When I was little, she used to tell me a story." He swallowed hard. "Some stranger paid for her operation." Margaret remained silent. "He saved her life." Lucas stared at Walter's handwriting. "My mother always said our family existed because of that surgery." His voice cracked. "And it was Walter." For several moments, neither of them spoke. The garage felt different now. Sacred, somehow, filled with echoes of things Walter had done that nobody knew. Finally, Lucas carefully closed the folder, then looked at Margaret. "If Gregory thinks he's taking this place." His jaw tightened. "He's got a fight coming." Margaret smiled, because at that moment she realized something extraordinary. Walter Holloway had been gone for 12 years. Yet people were still standing beside him, and his greatest acts of kindness were only beginning to come due. At that exact moment, a silver sedan turned into the parking lot. Natalie had returned, and this visit would change everything. Natalie stepped out of her car slowly,
This time, she wasn't carrying questions.
She wasn't carrying arguments either. She looked tired. The kind of tired that came from thinking too much.
Margaret met her halfway across the parking lot. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Natalie surprised her.
"I came to help." Margaret blinked.
"Help?"
Natalie nodded. "If you'll let me." The words hung between them. Simple, honest, and long overdue. Margaret smiled. "Of course, sir." For the next several days, Natalie stayed at the station. At first, she observed. She watched customers arrive throughout the day. She watched people stop for coffee, even when they didn't need gas. She watched Lucas repair vehicles with patience and honesty. Most importantly, she watched her mother. The woman standing behind the counter was not the same person who had left the courthouse months earlier. The change was impossible to miss. Margaret laughed more. She stood straighter. She made decisions without seeking approval. For the first time in Natalie's life, her mother seemed completely comfortable being herself. One afternoon, Natalie sat on the porch with Benjamin Tate. The old farmer sipped coffee while watching traffic move along State Route 42. "Can I ask you something?" Natalie said. Benjamin nodded. "Why does everybody care so much about this place?" Benjamin smiled. "Because it was never just a gas station." Natalie listened quietly. "Your grandfather helped people when nobody else would." Benjamin pointed toward the valley. "Half the families around here have a story about Walter Holloway." Natalie looked toward the station. The answer suddenly felt obvious. This wasn't property. It wasn't real estate. It wasn't an investment. It was part of the community. A few days later, Evelyn Bradford arrived carrying several boxes of legal files. Preparations for the hearing had intensified. The court date was only 2 weeks away. Inside the station, the counter became a temporary legal office. Documents covered every available surface. Property records, tax filings, Walter's will, transfer deeds, historical assessments. Evelyn worked methodically through everything. One afternoon, she looked up from a stack of papers. "We're going to win." Margaret laughed nervously. "You sound very confident." "I am." Evelyn tapped Walter's will. The law is remarkably clear on this. Still, Margaret worried. Years of living with Gregory had left scars. He always seemed to find a way. He always had another angle, another strategy, another advantage. Natalie noticed the fear. That evening they sat together on the porch after closing. The mountains were dark silhouettes beneath a sky filled with stars. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Natalie broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Margaret turned toward her daughter. Natalie's eyes were fixed on the valley. "I took Dad's side." Margaret remained quiet. "I believed him." Natalie swallowed. "I thought you were making a mistake coming here." The admission clearly hurt. Margaret reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "You were worried." "I was wrong." Margaret smiled softly. "No." Natalie looked confused. "You were doing what I spent years doing." "What?" "Listening to Gregory." The truth settled heavily between them. For the first time, Natalie saw it, not as a daughter, as an adult. Her father had always controlled the narrative. He spoke with certainty. People followed certainty, even when it wasn't wisdom. Natalie looked toward the station, then back at her mother. "I don't think Dad understands what this place means." Margaret laughed quietly. "No, he thinks this is about money." It never was. For several moments, they sat together beneath the stars. The distance between them slowly disappeared. The next morning, something unexpected happened. 3 residents arrived carrying signed statements, then 5 more, then 10. People wanted to help. Some had stories about Walter. Others simply wanted the court to understand what the station meant to the valley. By the end of the week, Evelyn had collected dozens of testimonies. Every one told the same story. Walter Holloway had spent his life serving others, and his daughter was continuing that work. As the hearing approached, the station became more than a business. It became a symbol, a reminder that some things could not be measured in dollars. The night before court, Margaret locked the front door and stood alone beside the old sign. Fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. Inside the station sat people willing to fight for her. Outside stood a community willing to stand beside her. And for the first time in 33 years, Margaret realized she wasn't walking into battle alone. Tomorrow, she would face Gregory in court, and this time, everything would be different. The morning of the hearing arrived, cold and gray. Margaret stood outside the courthouse for several moments before walking inside.
The same courthouse, the same stone steps, the same heavy doors. Only this time, she felt different.
The last time she had entered this building, she had walked away believing she had lost everything. Today, she was here to protect what she had rebuilt. Evelyn Bradford waited near the entrance, holding a leather briefcase.
She greeted Margaret with a confident nod.
"You ready?"
Margaret took a slow breath.
"As ready as I'm going to be." Together, they entered the courtroom. The room was smaller than Margaret expected. Rows of wooden benches lined the walls. A few local residents sat quietly in the back. Benjamin was there. So was Lucas. Natalie sat beside them. Their presence steadied her. For years, she had faced difficult moments alone. Now, she didn't have to. Across the room sat Gregory. His attorney, Howard Sterling, organized documents neatly on the table before him. Gregory looked calm, confident, as if the outcome had already been decided. Margaret recognized that expression. She had spent decades watching him wear it. The hearing began promptly. The judge reviewed the case file, then invited Howard Sterling to present Gregory's argument. The attorney stood. He spoke professionally, smoothly. He discussed property valuation, future development, potential increases in land value, projected highway expansion plans. The words sounded impressive. But as Margaret listened, she noticed something. There was very little substance underneath them. Everything depended on possibilities. What might happen? What could happen? What perhaps would happen someday? When he finished, Evelyn stood. Unlike Sterling, she used very few words. She presented facts, nothing more. The original deed, Walter Holloway's will, tax records, property transfer documents, the chain of ownership stretching back decades. Each document established the same truth. The station had belonged to Walter. Walter left it solely to Margaret. The property had never been jointly owned. Gregory had never contributed to it, never invested in it, never maintained it, never paid taxes on it, never even visited it during the marriage. Evelyn's voice remained calm throughout. The evidence spoke for itself. When she finished, the courtroom became very quiet. The judge spent several minutes reviewing the documents. Then he looked toward Gregory's attorney. "Do you have evidence contradicting this chain of ownership?" Sterling hesitated. For the first time all morning, uncertainty appeared on his face. "No, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Do you have evidence the property was intentionally concealed during the divorce proceedings?" Again, hesitation. "No." The judge closed the file. His decision came quickly. "The motion is denied." Silence. Then relief surged through Margaret so suddenly she almost lost her breath. The judge continued. "The property is clearly separate inherited property. There is no legal basis to reopen the settlement." He struck the gavel once. "This matter is concluded." Just like that, it was over. Months of fear, weeks of preparation, gone in seconds. Across the room, Gregory sat motionless. His attorney quietly gathered papers. The confidence was gone. Outside the courthouse, sunlight finally broke through the clouds. Margaret stepped onto the courthouse steps and closed her eyes for a moment. The air felt lighter, freer. She heard footsteps behind her. "Gregory." She turned. For several seconds, they simply looked at each other. 33 years of history stood between them. Neither spoke first. Finally, Gregory broke the silence. "When did you become this person?" Margaret almost laughed. The question was so sincere, so bewildered, as if he genuinely didn't understand. She studied the man she had once loved, the man who measured success by numbers, the man who always needed more. Then she thought about Walter, the station, the valley, the people waiting for her at home, and suddenly the answer felt obvious. "I've always been this person." Gregory frowned. "No." "Yes." Margaret smiled gently. "You just never bothered to see her." The words landed harder than anger ever could. For a moment, Gregory looked away. Not defeated, not broken, just confronted by a truth he couldn't argue against. Margaret turned and walked toward her truck. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The drive home felt different. The mountains seemed brighter, the road familiar. When she finally reached Holloway Fuel and Auto Repair, Benjamin, Lucas, and Natalie were waiting. They already knew. News traveled fast in the valley. Margaret climbed out of the truck. No speeches were necessary, no celebrations. Benjamin simply handed her a cup of coffee. Lucas grinned. Natalie hugged her.
And for the first time in many years, Margaret felt completely at peace. That evening, as darkness settled across the mountains, she walked to the electrical panel beside the office. Walter's handwritten label still marked every switch. She found the one labeled sign. Then she paused. For 12 years, the old sign had remained dark. Tonight that would change. Margaret reached forward and flipped the switch. Outside, something began to glow, and the entire valley would soon see it. The sign glowed softly against the darkness. For the first time in 12 years, the faded letters of Holloway Fuel and Auto Repair were illuminated once again. Margaret stood in the doorway and stared at it. Benjamin stood beside her. Lucas leaned against the porch railing. Natalie watched from the steps. No one spoke. Some moments were too important for words. Finally, Benjamin smiled. Your dad would have liked that. Margaret looked toward the sign. For a brief second, she could almost imagine Walter standing beside it, hands stained with grease, coffee mug in one hand, pretending not to be proud. The image made her smile. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The Allegheny Highlands transformed. Dogwoods bloomed along State Route 42. Fresh, green leaves replaced bare branches. And with every passing week, the station grew busier. The fuel pumps operated steadily. The garage stayed full. Travelers stopped for coffee. Neighbors gathered on the porch. The station had become more than a business. It had become the center of the valley once again. Lucas flourished. The young mechanic enrolled in an online certification program and spent evenings studying at the counter after closing. Margaret often found him reading manuals beside Walter's old journal. His skills improved quickly. Customers specifically requested him. More importantly, he had found something he never expected, a place where he belonged. One afternoon, Margaret discovered him teaching a nervous teenager how to change oil. The boy had never held a wrench before. Lucas patiently explained every step, the same way Walter once taught Margaret. Watching them, she realized something. Kindness wasn't inherited through blood. It was inherited through example. And Walter's example was still shaping lives. Natalie visited often, not because she felt obligated, because she wanted to. Her relationship with Margaret deepened in ways neither had expected. For years, they had spoken around each other. Now, they truly listened. In May, Natalie returned with her 2 children. Margaret's grandchildren had never spent much time in the mountains. The station fascinated them. The old cash register, the repair garage, the endless stream of customers with stories to tell. Margaret showed them Walter's reading glasses, his unfinished crossword puzzle, the old photographs hanging behind the counter. She told them about the grandfather they had never known, and for the first time, Walter's legacy became part of another generation. The valley noticed the change in Margaret, too. People often said she looked younger, not because time had reversed, because purpose had returned. The sadness she carried after the divorce slowly disappeared. It was replaced by confidence, by peace, by belonging. One warm afternoon near the end of spring, a battered minivan pulled into the station. A young woman climbed out. 3 children sat inside. The youngest appeared asleep. Margaret immediately recognized the expression on the woman's face. Exhaustion, worry, the same look she had once seen in the mirror. "Can I get $20 worth of gas?" the woman asked quietly. Margaret nodded. As the tank filled, she checked the tires and noticed one was nearly flat. Without saying anything, she added air. Then she topped off the windshield fluid. When everything was finished, the woman opened her purse. Her face fell. She counted bills twice, then looked up. I'm closer. Margaret smiled. The answer came naturally now. No problem. The woman blinked. What? You can pay next time. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Why would you do that? Margaret glanced toward the station, toward the garage, toward the sign glowing above the road. Then she smiled. Because someone once taught me what's important. The woman drove away with a full tank and tears in her eyes. And Margaret finally understood something. Walter had never helped people because he was generous. He helped people because he believed communities survived by taking care of one another. The realization stayed with her long after sunset. Lucas was closing the garage. Benjamin was winning another checker game. Laughter drifted through the evening air. Home. The word came effortlessly now. Not the house Gregory kept. Not the life she lost. This The station, the valley, the people, the purpose. That was home. Later that night, Margaret locked the front door and paused beside Walter's reading glasses. The unfinished crossword still sat beside them. She had never completed it. She never would. Some things deserved to remain exactly as they were. She switched off the lights and climbed the stairs to the apartment above the station. The familiar smell of coffee and motor oil greeted her. Outside, the sign continued glowing against the mountain night, a symbol of everything she had regained. At 58 years old, Margaret Holloway had thought her life was ending. Instead, it was finally beginning. And as long as the coffee stayed hot, the lights stayed on, and someone was willing to help a stranger in need, Walter Holloway's legacy would never fade. The station everyone once called worthless had become the most valuable thing Margaret would ever own, not because of what it was worth, but because of what it meant.